Hello all, my name is Benjamin Solder, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on servant leadership. And so the very first thing I actually wanted us to start off with, because I think servant leadership, despite having a very paradoxical name, is relatively more well known than a lot of the other leadership theories that this class is discussing. I think it's almost a household term in some sense nowadays. So real fast, just take a couple seconds and think to yourself, what characteristics and behaviors come to mind when I think of a servant leader? What qualities might that person have, and or what actions do they regularly engage in when they are acting as a servant leader? I think especially for the people who are in healthcare in this class, a lot of times examples of our leaders interacting with patients in a certain way come to mind pretty easily because we always know that we have to put patients first. But then also looking and thinking, hey, are there any examples in which it's truly an attending going out of their way for an intern, or hopefully, maybe this happens less frequently, but it would be great if a hospital administrator was going out of their way for providers. But characteristics that come to mind, we think of this person as extremely outgoing. In fact, there's some overlap with personality studies, and extroversion ranks up there, and openness for people who other people consider to be good servant leaders. They did studies on that. But then the behaviors, of course, it's we think of putting other people first or going out of your way to help somebody else. And these are actually characteristics that have made it these are behaviors that have made it into the model of servant leadership. One of the largest criticisms, though, of servant leadership right now is that it isn't very well defined. So what first happened is a gentleman by the name of Robert Greenleaf was the first to try introduce this concept of servant leadership. He was the first to coin the term. And at the time, it wasn't a theory. It was just, again, a concept, because there was a lack of data on if this was a good actual leadership theory. What components would be involved in this, and could we actually measure out these components to see what makes a successful leader? And for a very long time, that was not the case. It was just kind of a general accepted idea of what servant leadership is without any of the data for the specific components that could be included. And so the specific components actually continue to be defined in the literature, and there's some ongoing discussion of what behaviors specifically should be included in servant leadership. And we'll go over kind of the most accepted model in just a little bit. Of note, Robert Greenleaf was a Quaker, and I was able to go back and find some of his original writings on the topic as well. Very interesting, and we'll get to he was writing in a different time period, but I think there's still a large overlap between what he saw the role of servant leadership in society at that time and what could be considered the role of servant leadership in society today too. But I started with the thought exercise because those specific components continue to be defined, and we continue to try and collect data that support each of those components as being a necessary piece of the servant leadership theory. So here's the most accepted model with the data that we have at the time for what makes servant leadership. And they say that there are three major three major chunks to this model. The first being a discussion of the antecedent conditions that have to be in place for the servant leadership theory and the servant leadership model to really be effective. What specific behaviors are included or are conducted by servant leaders is being studied, and then which outcomes do we directly see that these specific behaviors and these conditions affect. So the conditions that are necessary for a servant leadership model to be effective, they have grouped into context and culture. And so, for instance, they say servant leadership is most effective in contexts and cultures where there is not giant power distribution or a rigid hierarchy that is well accepted and has been there for generations, it's hard to go in as a new leader and say, I'm going to, most act as a servant leader in this organization. People are not ready a lot of times, or they want to respect and maintain kind of that rigid power hierarchy, and servant leadership is not a good fit for institutions that have that. So in some ways, I question, we have a pretty rigid hierarchy in medicine, which is beneficial in a lot of ways and conducts pretty clear communication and lets everybody know what their role is. Sorry, I have something in my throat I cannot get rid of. And they say that it's best, though, if there's kind of a more equal power distribution already aligned. It's very easy for servant leaders to come in and adopt this particular model. The leader attributes, again, we kind of went over a little bit, touching on extroversion and openness, but people have to also have a very high degree of emotional intelligence. And so that was one of the things at the beginning of our course we discussed, is that emotional intelligence is not something included inside of stable personality traits. Emotional intelligence is actually something that can be developed and taught. But it is something that servant leaders must have a high degree of in order to recognize the emotions of others and be able to support and affect those emotions as well. We'll go over that more in just a little bit. And then follower receptivity. They've actually done studies that showed that if people didn't want a servant leader, they didn't necessarily want to be empowered or allowed independence or emotionally supported or things like that, servant leadership was less effective than other leadership styles. So there were 7 behaviors that were defined by servant leadership. Hold on, I'm going to pause this recording and get some water real fast, and I'll be right back. Okay, and we're back. So sorry about that. So there were 7 behaviors. Oopsies. Go back. There we go. There were 7 behaviors that were defined as being components of the servant leadership model. The first being conceptualizing. So servant leaders have to be able, what they mean by conceptualizing is being able to understand the organization that they're leading. They have to understand its mission, its vision, all components and roles that people currently accept for their own role within the organization, and then also have the kind of foresight to see where the organization is going and what needs the organization will have. So that is conceptualizing, is a very detailed, thorough understanding of the organization and where it's headed and how all of the pieces fit together in order to be an effective servant leader. The next piece was emotional healing. So again, that emotional intelligence, being able to recognize the emotions of others and what problems they have, and then specifically addressing the needs of others in order to support every member of the organization. It's a very, very much so focused on individual relationships between the servant leader and the members. Putting followers first, similar to emotional healing, or we have to clarify this term, is actually putting the follower's needs, or what is recognized when a follower needs emotional healing, the servant leader actually has to prioritize that person's needs ahead of their own. Again, the leader eats last concept from military operations. Same thing here, but extending that specifically to emotional needs as well. Then helping followers grow and succeed. Again, you're like, okay, that sounds like what we just talked about. The distinction being that you're helping followers with their long-term, even career goals in some instances. So it's not just addressing their needs, but it's actually helping them succeed in the long run above just kind of responding to whatever they need or supporting them. Instance, or a good example of this that came to mind, at least within medicine, is that your professional mentors, the people who are helping you network whenever you are looking for residencies or looking for new jobs, seeing what positions are available, writing you those letters, even if it means that you're going to have less time to donate or give to your existing organization, wherever you're at now. A servant leader would accept that and still help you kind of propel your career forward. Behaving ethically, servant leaders, there's a great example provided by Nordhaus about one CEO getting some intel or data that was leaked from a competitor, and they ripped it up, didn't read it, put it in the shredder, and then called their rival CEO and said, hey, I think you have a security leak, as a prime example of behaving ethically by servant leaders. Empowering their followers would be the sixth behavior. Empowering their followers is allowing their followers to practice independence, to build as much confidence as they can. A great example is I have seen attendings really run the teams, and then I have seen attendings that really allow the upper level to run the team. And I think that is a great example within medicine of kind of gaining independence. I'm still here to support you, but it is truly your decision making. You get to grow and succeed, and then you get to within kind of business aspects, the example was provided, you get to do your own projects or pick your own projects and pick the next directions that you think this company should go, and we can give you resources to do that. And then creating value for community is the last behavior that's included. And that is servant leaders include all of the members of the organization to go back to the community and see how they can help. A lot of times this is paid time off for community service projects and things like that, specifically within organizations. And so the outcomes that are really well documented after we have these antecedent conditions and these behaviors in effect is that we really see market improvements in follower growth and performance. Above, there have even been, what's the type of review, meta-analysis reviews, where they go back through and they compare servant leadership models to leader member exchange, LMX models, and they found that followers were more, they performed even better in their roles than with other leadership theories. And then organizational performance overall really took off because they found that the followers were recommitted to the organization specifically. So they went above and beyond even what was specifically outlined in their job descriptions as needed to benefit the health of the organization. And I think that was kind of the one key takeaway, is that with all of the behaviors you see listed in the middle of servant leaders, they're not directly contributing to the overall, they're not propelling the organization forward in a certain direction. What they're doing, though, is they are creating a healthier organization. They're coalescing followers and leaders and members alike and making sure that everybody has the resources they need, and then allowing things to proceed, not necessarily pulling things or pushing things in a certain direction, but they're most focused on organizational health. And from there, things grow and followers perform. And I mentioned that there was a strong moral component. So Greenleaf was writing during a different time, but it was fascinating when I was reading some of his stuff to see exactly how much overlap there is between what he saw in his society and what we see in society today. And he saw a clear role for servant leadership and he said it must have a moral, ethical component, as we see in the transformational leadership theory and ethical leadership theory as well. I would mark this up as a third that has a moral component. And this is a quote from Greenleaf. He says, with education at that time that is preponderantly abstract and analytical, it is no wonder that a preoccupation with criticism exists and that not much thought is given to what can I do about it. So he was specifically responding to people criticizing government and institutions at the time, society, without actually proposing any solutions. I think we see a lot of that today, actually, with people criticizing government and institutions, and rightfully so. I myself love to criticize institutions, sometimes including my med school, that have policies or things in place that are not to the benefit of all people and do not promote justice. And this was a great example of, as a servant leader, we can adopt servant leadership. And if we had more servant leaders, we would actually be able to build societies and structures and institutions that would help all people. So I will leave you with that explanation, and thank you very much for watching.